Hello, everyone. Okay, today I'm going to be talking about my doctoral research. And I did doctoral research for my dissertation while I was in school, and then postdoctoral research, which was independent research that I did that expanded on my dissertation research. And what I did is I was studying religious apparitions that were experienced in childhood, and my participants were adults who recollected their childhood experiences. And my research was really strict. The people who would be qualifying for the research had to have experienced what's called a corporeal apparition, meaning it's like you could be sitting there and having coffee with them at a coffee shop, and talking away or whatever, and they're right there and you could touch them or whatever. And they had to be biblical or, mostly Christian characters, Christian and Jewish. And that was because I needed to be able to finish my research and graduate. So I had really strict criteria, and it was not easy for people to qualify for the research. Now, what I'm doing in this particular presentation is I'm going to be sharing over a series of videos. I'm going to be sharing my doctoral research and my postdoctoral research, which had expanded. My doctoral research, my participants had to have had the experience before they were 12 years old. And I did that because I wanted them to have had the experience before they were completely indoctrinated into the world. So especially the younger kids, because they're more open. And that, you're seeing a lot of the really famous apparitions from around the world that were experienced by children. And I'll be talking about those particularly. Okie dokie. And there we go. Okay, so what is supernatural? For the purposes of this video and the videos that are going to be part of this series, it's anything that's yet unexplained by science. So it can be in the realms of the paranormal, the mystical, transcendent, and transpersonal. Just pick a word. So I'm kind of keeping it broad because there's so many people out there, and they're looking at the transpersonal and the paranormal or the supernatural as the same things. And then also there's another word called anomalous experiences and unusual human experiences. So we're just going to lump them all in under supernatural, and particularly what it has to do with my research, because my research was looking at religious apparitions and spiritual or mystical encounters. So we will carry on here. Okay, and then what is a supernatural encounter? And it's not explained by science, basically. People can perceive it, but science can't explain it. So according to science, it doesn't exist. And it may or may not be seen by others. So in the first part of this presentation for this week, I'm going to be talking about religious apparitions. And for the most part, they were only experienced by the seers. So in some cases, there may have been on certain occasions where other people saw the same thing or something similar, but it was never exactly the same thing. And if there was a group of seers together, which I'll be showing you here in just a few minutes, then those seers, all saw pretty much the same thing. In science or in psychology, they would call this a hallucination. And again, they can't explain it. So according to Western medicine and pretty much, your basic psychology, it's considered psychosis, or like having a psychotic event. And it can be considered pathology. And these are things where, yeah, but you're crazy, what you're seeing, and, we have to medicate you to make that go away. So that's what's unfortunate. And how do the experiences vary? People see a variety of manifestations, and most cause a profound spiritual experience. The variety of manifestations, just as an example, again, I'm going to be talking today about religious apparitions, and and those would be like the vast majority, especially today, will be mainly Marian apparitions, meaning that the seers, the witnesses, they saw Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. That's who they saw. And it causes profound spiritual experience, like the impact of the experience itself while it's happening. And then there are also after effects, which I'll go into probably either next week or the week after. Okay, so I'm going to talk about religious apparitions because that's where we're going to get into my research. But just as a foundation, there have been reported, not just by children, but reported just from 1900 up to, I can't remember, the research that I got was, I think, up to like 2019. There has been just under 400 reported cases of people, not just children, but people seeing Mary or Jesus or saints or Saint Michael or whatever, Archangel Michael or whatever. And those reported cases means that they reported it to like the priest at the church, and it may have been, and those particular ones have been elevated to the point where they get investigated. And then the church, there's a whole process they go through to say, yeah, this is cool, and this is something you can come and worship here or whatever. And then it also gets elevated to the point where it's like they're saying, yes, this is like supernatural, it's definitely all good, we believe it was Mary, so yeah, we're going to say, give a check mark that this is all good. One of those was Our Lady of Lourdes, a Marian apparition that was experienced in 1858. And this is another thing, at least through my research, that the majority of the childhood experiences, really started, or at least were reported in the 1800s. So we have records of people like saints, or people who eventually became saints, but priests, nuns, monks, and of course, sometimes just ordinary people, but maybe spiritual, who had seen Mary or Jesus or, Archangel Michael or other angels, but they were adults. And the majority of them actually were people who were devout, and they may have been studying mysticism actually, and had teachers and all of that who were working with them, and they wanted to have a mystical experience. Now, the religious apparitions that I'm talking about, and especially in today's, and these are recorded cases, they were spontaneous experiences. They were not, the seers were not doing anything to initiate these experiences. Now, Bernadette Soubirous, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but she was 14 years old, and she saw Mary in like a grotto. And, she received information from, and she didn't say it was Mary. In fact, of the ones that I'm going to be telling you about, most of them just say a beautiful lady, or they describe this woman that they see. And really, sometimes it's not a woman, it's like a teenager. They describe the person as a teenager. But Bernadette in Lourdes, France, was told to do certain things. And so the apparition told her to dig in the dirt. And so she was digging in the dirt, and so the apparition was going to continue to dig. And as she was digging, all of a sudden a spring came up where she was digging. I mean, and she's digging with her hands. And so water started seeping up. And then all of a sudden it just kept coming up. And it actually formed like a creek from the spring. And so people heard about what happened to her, and understanding that, Catholicism was like a big thing and they believed in all these miracles. And so they were bringing their children in to like sick people. And one woman brought her child who was very ill, and she laid the baby in the water. And when she took the baby out of the water, the baby became well again. I don't know how long it took for that to happen. I don't know if it was spontaneous healing, which is a whole other thing that happens as well. But that is what really got it going, because this woman is like, oh my gosh, look what happened. And before you know it, pilgrims from everywhere came into Lourdes. And they still do today. I went there, I spent 4 days in Lourdes. I took a bunch of pictures, but unfortunately I'm from Northern California, little town Paradise that burnt down, and everything that I had in the home I was renting, all of my pictures, everything was gone, burned, turned to ash. So I can't share any of the pictures with you, but this is really an incredible place. And I may do a separate video just on my experience in Lourdes when I was there doing research for my dissertation. Also, too, she was kind of forced to become a nun, and that she died very young. I think from a lung disease. It may have been oh golly, my brain just went dead for this minute. But anyway, she died like tuberculosis or something. So she really had a really ungood death. I've also been here. This is in Fatima, Portugal, Our Lady of Fatima. 3 children that were like shepherds, and they saw an angel, and then and this happened in 1917. And then the angel had them come back, where they were up on this hill where they were, I think it was sheep or goats. And that's when they saw the beautiful lady. So Lucia was the oldest, and that's her. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but that's her right here. She was 10 years old at the time. And then these 2 were her cousins, Francisco and Jacinta. And this is Portuguese, so it's probably pronouncing the J, Jacinta. Their experience was really traumatic. Bernadette's was too, but nothing like these kids. At the time in Portugal, I mean, there were like Catholic priests and nuns and stuff being murdered because there was, I guess, political upheaval. And so they were becoming there were a lot of atheistic type of thinking at that time. And so they saw the Catholic Church and nuns being a threat. And so they were killing people. And these kids, they would not rescind what they were saying. And the local priest got pretty freaked out and was just like, okay, you kids, this is going to cause us a lot of problem, and I'd really like to stay alive. And but the word got out, and just like in Lourdes, pilgrims came. And I mean, it's pretty incredible because they just kind of wiped out we're talking thousands of people on pilgrimage there, thousands. So they wanted a piece of these kids. It's like they wanted to touch them. They're hoping to get healed. There's a lot of trauma that goes on for children who've had these experiences. Severe trauma. So these 3 kids, the 2 younger ones, the brother and sister, Francisco and Jacinta, they died rather young. As kids, they died. And Lucia, she was still alive when I was doing my research, but they had her hidden away at a convent in Portugal, not in Fatima. They had her in another town. And I would have loved to have interviewed her, but boy, she was really protected by the Catholic Church, heavily protected. But these kids were traumatized. I mean, they were told that they were going to put them in hot boiling oil unless they told the truth, which means that to tell them that they didn't see this. And there's a whole other story about what they reported to what they saw. And I may even do a separate video on this one because I contributed a chapter to a book about these kids and what they reported and compared it to my research. Very interesting stuff. All right, and this happened in the United States in 1945. Joey Vitolo, I think he died not too long ago, but he saw the Virgin Mary and in the Bronx, and so she told him to come back for 9 days and pray in the same spot he saw her, which he did, and pray the rosary, which is a big thing that usually Mary is telling them to pray the rosary. And for those who aren't Catholic and not familiar, the rosary is a string of beads that each bead you say a particular prayer, and you go through the whole rosary, and that is, that's a way of praying each night. They want you to pray every day the rosary. And in some, I don't know, I suppose if you're really getting into it, I think there's like 5 different ways you can pray it, and you can just do the rosary 5 times. As a child, I was raised Catholic, and my mother had us do the rosary when we were children, and we would do it as a family because the whole thing was those who pray together stay together. So, but Joey would go and pray the rosary, word got out, again, just as is typical, and was just inundated with pilgrims, people going there and wanting to get a piece of this kid. And as a 9-year-old, he was just overwhelmed, and it would be all times of night. And I mean, he just one time just said, "Everybody get out of this house, get out of here." And of course, then they're looking at like he really didn't see the Virgin Mary because he's mean, or, he's a bad kid, because he wouldn't let everybody get a piece of him. And so that's when he kind of got bad news, basically. But still, that didn't stop people from coming. And he built a little shrine there for Mary where he would go and see her each night. So that's Joey Vitolo. And I don't remember the names of these girls. And I had a whole bunch of research materials. Oh God, I had bookshelves full of research materials that burned in the fire. But 4 girls in Garabandal, Spain, they witnessed an apparition of Mary. And this was in 1961 to 1965. So it was over a 4-year period. And in this particular case, they were trying to test them. Oh, it was awful. They were holding like lighters under their skin while they were in trance, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, to see if they were faking it. Unbelievable. So, I mean, it's like this would never be allowed today to actually, cause harm. And then, of course, there was this whole idea of, they're burning at the stake or whatever, which is, oh my God, it was really crazy during that time, at least from what I've read. So these 4 girls over a 4-year period in Spain saw the Virgin Mary. This, as well as the Fatima and the Lourdes, were approved by the church that this was a true. Now, Joey, the one I was just speaking about before, he didn't even, it got reported, but it isn't even the list that I have of almost 400. It's like 397 reported cases. And Joey Vitolo isn't even in that list. So because he wasn't like, a good boy or whatever, that, he didn't not let him get any sleep. He wasn't even in the list. So it didn't even get scrutinized. Then in Medjugorje, this one was a big one in 1981, and it's still ongoing with some of these kids. I think this little boy down here, if you can see, he does tours and he sees Mary wherever he goes, I guess. But they there was just a lot of controversy, and kind of still is, with the Catholic Church with this particular series of apparitions with these kids. But massive amounts of pilgrims go every year. Is massive amounts of pilgrims go to Medjugorje to be there. And there's stories about people who, they have their rosaries and they actually turn to gold. I've not seen that. I've not seen evidence of it, meaning people, that there's film of, their regular rosary and then it turns to gold. I've not seen that, but there are stories about that. This is just an example of the trance state. And one of the very interesting things, I think these are the girls from Garabandal, Spain. What happens, at least from witness testimonies of watching the kids who see when the apparition comes, they actually will fall to their knees. It's like they just drop, dead weight, drop to their knees and throw their heads back. And like you see here, and they're in a complete trance state because they're talking to the apparition. Now I think it's in Fatima, the kids would actually speak, but they were having a conversation, but no one could hear or see the apparition they're speaking to. And in this case, in Garabandal, which is very, very interesting, that they were supposed to get I think every time they saw the Virgin Mary, they got communion of the host. And if you're familiar with Catholicism, in the Mass, there's communion, which is when there's a small little wafer that's bread-like, but it's real thin, and it gets put on the tongue and by the priest or whoever is delivering it. And in this case, they asked for the Virgin, the Virgin Mary, they asked her to do a miracle so people would see it, so they could believe it and see it themselves or get to experience it. And when they were receiving communion, which basically they would put their tongue out a little bit to get the host on, they call it a host. The piece of the wafer is called a host, to get the host on their tongue so they'd take it in their mouth. But it just looked like somebody sticking their tongue out and closing their mouth. In this case, I don't remember which one of the girls it was, but it actually materialized on the tongue, a host. And they have a picture of it. And people are saying it's just a trick and they did this as a trick. Whatever. It's pretty impressive. But they actually had the host show up on their tongue, and that they have a picture of that. And so that's something that's documented, even though people argue that it's, some kind of trickery. But either way, it's pretty impressive. But these trance states happen, and they're incoherent to anything else. They're oblivious to anything else going on around them. And they're in a trance state, and it's like a bliss state where they're just, all they're focused on is what they're seeing. And it's pretty impressive. Now, I talk about mainly of sharing here like religious apparitions that are biblical, and everything I spoke about was actually apparitions of Mary, the Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus. But it's not just through Christianity or Catholicism that these experiences happen. In India, there is a person who was alive at one time called Babaji, and he will appear to people. So there's people in India who have actually seen an apparition appear before them, and it's Babaji. And not just Indians. I think there was somebody from the United States that was in India, and this was back when, probably in the early 1900s, visiting India, and they saw an apparition of Babaji. So it's not just limited to the apparition being there for people of India. A Westerner actually had this experience as well. So I hope you found this interesting. Next week, I'm going to be talking about my research. And so I'll be sharing the stories of the participants that I had in my research. And, that will, to me, it's fascinating because I did it, and I was so focused, and I love my research. So I'm going to have a lot of fun sharing that with you next week. So until next week, have a great time.